Clemson spring game. Clemson with a Z, at least on this show, because my speech will not allow me to say it any other way. CU, the Tigers, in other words, had their spring game this last Saturday. A lot to talk about. There was a really good feature on the front page of 24/7 Sports today. I think Chris Hummer talked to Anna Hickey up at Clemson, or 24/7 Sports site at Clemson, and had some really good feedback. Here's what's caught my eye. We talked about the Tigers a few times this spring. The running back position, they placed a premium on several things, as do most programs in spring, but one of the areas Dabo Swinney and his staff realized they needed to improve in is they just flat out weren't physical enough last year, and that's really a both sides of the ball type issue. But they look at the running game, like they look at that Notre Dame game when they lost. They look at the Ohio State game when they lost. They couldn't run the ball. They couldn't control the line of scrimmage, which was a problem in several different aspects of the season last year. And they couldn't run the ball worth anything, especially relative to the standard you would expect when you got a guy like Travis Etienne back there. So Etienne is gone. Lynn J. Dixon is the guy that if you were just kind of guesstimating a depth chart for Clemson, your finger would land on. But Kobe Pace is a guy who has really come on for them. And there are some people, I'm not saying it's a majority, but there are some people around the Clemson program who would indicate to you they think that Pace ultimately could be their more well-rounded back. Different body type maybe than Travis Etienne, but he could be their more well-rounded back. At the very least, obviously we have two bona fide number one running back candidates there. So that's a good thing. But also, when we go to the other side, when we talk about defense, the secondary for them, the linebacker core, the defensive line, there are varying degrees of question marks at all three levels of Clemson's defense. And you could talk about corner depth. You could talk about developing the pass rush. You could talk about the year one to year two jump for a lot of those big names on the defensive line, interior and pass rushers. But here's really what I circle back to. You're going to see, as we enter preview magazine season, a lot of that stat. And that stat is 10 returning starters on defense. Which brings us to the age-old question, how valuable are returning starters from a unit that was poor? Because Clemson's defense was poor last year. A lot of the pass defense metrics, I mean, they finished outside the top 25 for the first time in several years, like before they started going on the national title run. And so they snapped a long defensive streak of very impressive statistical resumes. And so it's great that we're bringing a lot of guys back from that unit. Just kind of curious to see what kind of production jump we see from last year to this year. Kick it over to Tuscaloosa, Alabama's wide receivers. Fascinating here. John Mechie is back, and outside from that, unless you're a diehard Crimson Tide fan, you don't recognize many of the names. I would argue Jaleel Billingsley is, for all intents and purposes, a wide receiver, but you understand what I'm saying here. So I think because of the depth situation in Alabama, and when I say situation, I mean just that, not a problem, a situation, at least two of these true freshman wide receivers are going to be impact players this year. Now, that could be Aguier Hall, that could be Christian Leary, it could be JoJo Earl, it could be any of a number of those guys. Obviously, I expect a combo of those guys to contribute. But also, let's not forget about the name Javon Baker, because we were sitting at this desk leading into the 2020 season, and I thought maybe Javon Baker was going to be a guy that stepped to the forefront. Maybe he was going to be the offensive true freshman equivalent of what Malachi Moore ended up being. Well, we were right about Malachi Moore. Javon Baker, it never really took off for him. Well, that's fine. He's only a second-year guy right now. And so Javon Baker, I think, is going to be a name also that steps up for him this year. But I think we have probably gotten as many questions about the quarterback situation in Alabama as any position group there, and that's not a surprise. But I haven't talked a lot about quarterbacks with Alabama this spring, and the reason is because I don't feel the need to. I told you at the beginning of spring, I'm going to reiterate it now. I don't really see that there's much of a competition there. There's competition in practice. When I say competition, I mean, is there really like a 65-35, 60-40 guess right now as to who the starter is going to be? If there is not injury, which we cross our fingers for across the board, Bryce Young's the starting quarterback there. And that, by the way, is not a knock on Paul Tyson. I want to reiterate something. I think Paul Tyson has developed and come a lot further than maybe a lot of people around the Alabama program thought he was going to from the first time he stepped foot on campus. And I am looking down the road. This is pure speculation. I want to stress that. This is not knowledge of anything. But if a guy like Paul Tyson were to ever end up somewhere else, let's say, whereas previously I would not have expected him to be a contributor many places, Alabama included, I think he's a guy who could go start somewhere. So again, that's pure speculation. I don't think Nick Saban would be all that happy with participating in that portion of this conversation. But Paul Tyson has really, I think, been a pleasant surprise for them. Bryce Young's the real deal. So I think Bryce Young's going to be the starter there. Also, interesting little practice note from Charlie Potter in Tuscaloosa today. J.C. Latham and Tommy Brockermeyer, big names from our signing day show. The top 2 tackles in the country, both signed with Alabama. I know that shocks you. Both running with the second team now, as of today at least. So a lot of mixing and matching going on in spring, but I was back home this weekend, and my cousin asked me, hey, Brockermeyer, is he going to see the field this year? I said, oh, he may, but I don't know if he's going to start. Well, hey, he's creeping ever closer, at least if spring depth charts are any indication. Let's go to Miami. Talked about the Clemson running back situation. How about the Miami running back situation? If I pressed you right now, I didn't give you time to look at your phone, and I said, Miami, RB1 this year, running back 1. Who is it? You'd say Cameron Harris. And you'd probably, maybe, somewhat, possibly be right. But might I suggest to you that if Rhett Lashlee is a tempo-based guy, which he is, and if Miami is fully committed to a tempo-based approach offensively, which they are, that Rhett Lashlee, in his own words, this is not speculation here either, Rhett Lashlee is going to want to land on a definitive number 1 running back. This is not an offense that is going to want to rely heavily on running back by committee. Now, it's great to have unlimited options, but when you're talking about drive to drive, you want a feature back. You want a bell cow. You want a guy that can be on the field 6, 8, 12 plays in a row if needed. And in an ideal world, they can flex out at receiver. They can give you everything in pass pro and receiving and not sacrifice anything in vision at the tailback position in a classical sense. But I say all that to say this. Cameron Harris is returning. Cameron Harris is a guy you think you can depend on. But the word from down there, at least at the running back position that I've heard, has not so much been about Cameron Harris. It's been Don Chaney Jr. Don Chaney Jr. is a guy, again, kind of like we talked about with Kobe Pace at Clemson, a little bit different body type, more like the 5'10", 5'11", 215, sort of the box frame. It's a good thing at the running back position. It's not a bad thing. But he's got that mixture of size and speed that you want, and it's very enviable if you have it. But also, it's the kind of guy, if you can get him from a concept standpoint and a blitz pickup standpoint, like if he nails down those aspects, it wouldn't shock me to see Don Chaney Jr. getting a ton of reps down there. In fact, it wouldn't shock me. I'm not ready to predict it yet. It wouldn't shock me if he ends up being their best option at tailback this year. So just something to watch at Miami. Let's kick it to Athens, Georgia. It's been a theme all spring long. It will continue to be. The Georgia defense, famous already in 2021, is the stat. And the stat is, now that Tyreek Stevenson transferred to Miami, ironically enough, Georgia's got all the corner talent in the world. There's not a single start amongst them. No one started. So whether we're talking about Amir Speed or Jalen Kimber, Keely Ringo, all these guys, they got all the stars. They don't have the experience, and there's only one way to get it. And it starts against the Clemson Tigers in week 1. But, and this was kind of underrated nationally because there's been a lot going on the past week in the hoops world, Georgia got a monster transfer. That is not a monster name, but for their needs, it was a monster transfer. Tyke Smith is a kind of a nickel, a star position for them. He's a guy, a defensive back who came in from West Virginia. This is pivotal. He's a good player, probably not an elite first-round draft pick type, a very good, dependable player. I don't know, maybe ends up going first round. We'll see. But here's why it's so big for Georgia. They were already having to get a lot of guys in the defensive secondary. What other kind of secondary is there, by the way? They were having to get a lot of guys ready to play positions at this level that they haven't started at. If you also had to cross-train a lot of those young guys at, let's say, corner and that nickel spot, it was going to be a 5-alarm cluster for the first several weeks of the season. I'm not promising you it's not going to be now, but if you have a dependable option, again, barring injury, we'll knock on the desk here. I think it's made of wood. I smell lacquer, so yeah, it's got to be covering wood. If you have Smith able to lock down that star position, it no longer forces you to cross-train out of desperation. Now, you will cross-train guys because you have to have depth at every position. You have to have contingencies at every position. But all of a sudden, Kirby Smart and Dan Lanning can focus a lot more on, let's just make sure these guys have one of these corner spots figured out before we add onto their plate nickel responsibilities, dime responsibilities, nickel and money, and whatever terminology you use there. My point is, that's the kind of transfer that is, it's not going to be on the front page of 247sports.com. It could be the difference in a 24-21 game this year to where Georgia gets the win versus the loss. One more batted pass, one more incomplete, one more solid coverage downfield that forces a quarterback to eat the ball and then take a dive short of the sticks and punt away. I mean, that kind of stuff, it decides division races in some cases. That's the kind of name. That's the reason we do these kinds of segments. That's the kind of name that you look back on if let's say you're a very, very intent gambler and you want every edge you can have. That's the kind of name you need to know. That's the difference in a half point, 3/4 point, in an average game simulated 100 times. That could be the difference in you eating, let's say, ribeye versus ramen noodles. I miss the Ramen Express. I got to be honest with you. The season can't get here soon enough.